Good afternoon. I'm going to wait just a moment to make sure that I am live. And I am. So I don't lose that. Let me go ahead and get everything ready. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jamie Owen. I am one of the attorneys at Student Legal Services, and today we're going to be talking about contract basics, NIL, and social media influencer edition. So we're going to be talking a little bit about some things that are specific to those sorts of contracts that we've run into in our office, but we're also going to be just talking about the way to look at contracts in general, or the way that I look at contracts in general, which is really useful for all sorts of contracts, not just not just those particular sorts of contracts. So let's see. Just notice that it's a little bit off. So hopefully this is better. So what is Student Legal Services? We are free for enrolled students, and we provide all sorts of different types of legal services for students at no charge, as long as you are enrolled in classes. So we help out with landlord-tenant issues, consumer, traffic, most criminal, name changes, a little bit of everything. We do not handle stuff against the university, the state of Florida, student versus student matters, and other sorts of things that are specialized. One of the things we do is review contracts, however, and quite a bit. So today, the objective is just to kind of educate you regarding some basic contract concepts and what you should be looking for when you review a contract. So a couple disclaimers. Well, I'm happy to review a contract, and I'm not an agent. So if we're talking about NIL or social media influencer type contracts, we don't negotiate deals. We will just review the contract. We do not handle business formation, tax, immigration, or other intellectual property matters, that could come up in those. I'm not an expert on NIL or influencer marketing deals, so I really can't tell you what is fair compensation or anything like that. I can maybe help you figure out a way to look at it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I can identify some issues. It might not be everything that you may need to think about when you're reviewing one of these contracts. Just a little beware. There are scams out there. There are people who are looking to, do some things towards students and other people who might be, entering into deals like this. You just need to be careful. If they're asking for money up front, that was one of the scams that was going around was, oh, we will give you discounted product in exchange for you doing a review. People send money, no product. It's not really a thing. So just be careful. Know your worth. It's better to wait for the right deal than the first deal. And generally, we say if it sounds too good to be true, it is. It's not, it probably is, it is. At least that's been my experience. So just a year ago, this is kind of the last day of a full year of athletes being able to enter into, student athletes being able to enter into contracts like this. There's a lot of provisions. it can't be linked to performance. It can't conflict with athletics. And, you are required to disclose it to athletics hopefully before signing. And it's a state law. So I always tell people who might be student athletes who are here on a non-immigrant visa, they're here on a student visa, that they would need to talk to global or in athletics before entering into one of those, because it could have implications for that visa. So just keep all of that in mind. And then just a little bit about agents. I'm just going to touch on this briefly. All agents for athletes must be licensed in the state of Florida. You can check that on myfloridalicense.com and look the person up to see if they are indeed licensed. You can also hire an attorney to act as sort of an agent, and they need to be barred in the state of Florida. And then as far as social media influencers, there are some talent agent provisions in our state law, but there's some debate as to whether or not they actually apply to influencers. And it might depend on sort of work that you're doing. And it's kind of, artists is kind of defined pre-social media, pre-internet. So like model, stage, television, acting, that sort of thing. So, it might be arguable if someone is a fashion influencer and they're doing a lot of modeling shots and that's primarily what they do, and maybe even walk in shows or something like that, then that might be more falling traditionally under that statute. But there isn't necessarily something that encompasses a lot of, social media sort of stuff that we see now. Just one quick thing, that if you are being paid to do things online, you do need to, disclose that. It's the FTC rules. I see a lot of student athletes, not just at UCF, but elsewhere, not necessarily disclosing as well as I think that they should. So make sure you're doing that. Hashtag ad, disclose it's a paid partnership. If you have a family relationship with the brand, or you're given product for free, that's all sort of stuff that you need to disclose. And the FTC does have a section on their website that you can go and look at, and different guides that they provide that you could find helpful. So now I'm going to get into contracts. If you guys have questions, you can drop them in the chat and I will try my best to address them, as I see them, or if I have an answer. And I'll try to keep an eye on that moving forward. But just to give you a little bit about contracts in general, basically you can agree to whatever you want, and courts generally aren't going to want to get involved to modify the terms of your contract. They certainly will in some circumstances, but it's better to make sure that you avoid bad contracts in the first place, instead of hoping that courts will help you, if you can even access the court in the first place, which we'll touch on in a bit. Once you sign a contract, you're in it. So unless there's a provision where you can terminate the contract in the contract, there isn't a cooling off period. Many people think that there is, but there really isn't, except in a few very small circumstances. For the most part, leases, any employment contracts, anything else, it's kind of, the moment you sign it. You can always break a contract, because I'll hear students or people say like, hey, well, I heard so-and-so got out of a contract or broke their contract. Well, yes, you can break your contract, but there can be consequences. So make sure to keep that in mind. You might be able to get out of it, but there might be a penalty you have to pay, or so forth. To be a valid contract, it doesn't have to be very much. I think the thing that sometimes is talked about in legal circles is the cocktail napkin at the bar, that somebody scribbles on. It really can be that. It just needs offer, acceptance, some sort of mutual understanding of what's going to be in the contract, and then something of value must be exchanged, and you have to be competent. You usually could potentially invalidate a contract if you're intoxicated when you sign it. Not something I recommend doing, is signing a contract when intoxicated. And it doesn't necessarily need to be in writing, but we strongly recommend that it is. And the trend is to avoid really complicated legal language, but we certainly do still see a lot of language that is a little tricky. So major elements to look for in a contract. In this sense, I'm not talking about legal elements. It's a different thing, but basically the themes that I'm looking for when I look at a contract. So duties of the parties, you know, the meat of what you're supposed to be doing. Term, how long does it last? Termination, can you get out of it? Modification, can it be changed? And disputes, how will they be handled? And, you know, how will that go? So duties of the parties, you know, so I'm gonna be looking at this like a little bit, you know, like I said, in NIL and influencers. So, you know, is there a commitment to appearances, social media? Are they reasonable? You know, can you fulfill the terms given other commitments? Is there any flexibility in the commitments? Are you agreeing to exclusivity? You know, these are all things that you have to look at, you know, if you're entering into a contract of this nature. You know, some of this goes in regular employment contracts. Is there like a non-compete clause in your contract? Those are things like that. And a lot of the things that I say, you know, you break it down into time. How much time is this going to take you? Does it actually spell out what the duties are of the parties? This is what we'll see a lot in these NIL student athlete contracts, is that they'll say something about social media, but it's really kind of vague. It's not, you know, you have to post on your Instagram, you know, a story and a grid post or whatever it is, a reel. You know, it's really not, it doesn't really spell out exactly what you're supposed to do and how often, or even like how long do you have to keep it on your social media. So those are all things that you should be, you know, kind of looking at for that. And then looking at what they're asking you to do, you know, is the compensation reasonable given the time commitment? You know, if you're getting paid $500 to go to a store and, you know, take pictures and sign autographs for 2 hours, that might be reasonable. If you're asked to do that once a month for 6 months, $500 might not be that reasonable. So you have to kind of look at that. When and how will you get paid? You know, how is that going to happen? What's the timeline for you getting paid? I saw a contract where payment was contingent on the party getting paid by a third party. They were kind of like a middleman, and I didn't really like that very much, because it was really kind of like, well, you could end up doing this and not get paid. So, you know, that's something to consider. How is your image going to be used? Do you have any control over the direction of the, you know, project? Veto power, you know, I think we all have like, oh, please don't share that photo. You know, that sort of thing. Is there any sort of indemnification? So that's kind of a legal term, and I see that a lot in agent contracts. Basically, if you do something that causes harm to another party, are you agreeing to come in then and take on responsibility for that? You know, hire them an attorney, pay any sort of fines or court cost or judgments that might be entered into against them. And you kind of have to look at those and see how they're written and see, you know, if that exposes you to anything. And then is there any sort of confidentiality requirements? You know, is there stuff you're not supposed to talk about in regards to this contract? Is it reasonable? Are they asking you to not talk about things that maybe you might feel like you're going to need to talk about? You know, you have to look at all of that. And to kind of swing back a little bit to the exclusivity, you know, sometimes when you enter into one of these contracts, they want you to only to agree not to enter into any other contract with someone else for a certain time frame. And sometimes those can be written so broadly that it excludes a lot of other places. So, that's something you need to look at too. Well, is the compensation I'm getting worth it enough to me to agree not to enter into another deal with somebody similar? Or is it narrowly tailored enough, just to kind of hit that one category, and then I can go on and do other deals that might come, my way. Term, pretty similar, pretty straightforward. How long does it last? Just a note about NIL is that under the terms of the statute, any deals entered into as a student athlete terminate when you are no longer a student athlete. So when you declare to go pro or declare for the draft, whatever it is, that's kind of the term. Are you required to do anything at the end of the term? Are you supposed to return anything, destroy anything, exchange information? One of the things that I've seen some people try to bargain for is to get sales or marketing data that the company might have in regards to the project that they worked on with them. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Is that something you can ask for? And that could be really useful when that deal ends, to either leverage to renew the deal or to take that data and use that as leverage for a new deal. You can kind of show your power, marketing power, into that. So keep that in mind. A lot of times maybe at the end of the deal, you still have to keep the social media posts you did up for so long, or they're allowed to use your image for so long afterwards. So that's something to keep in mind too. Even though the contract might be over, there might still be some lasting things that you've agreed to as part of the contract. Can you get out of the contract? Can you terminate the contract before the end of the term? So who can terminate it and why? A lot of contracts don't really have a termination provision in them. Some agent contracts do, though. I'll see something like with the 14 days notice or a little bit like that, you can get out of the contract, and that's really quite nice to allow for you to get out of it. What sort of notice do you have to give? Does it have to be in writing? How long? Are there any consequences? Do you forfeit anything? Is there sometimes what they'll call like liquidated damages, which is an amount you agree on ahead of time as far as what the harm is for you to have gotten out of the contract? So those are things you have to look at as well to see if something like that is in there. Generally, I'm going to like a contract that has a way you can get out of it. If it turns out it's not working out, can you get out of it? One thing we see in NIL and influencer and other sorts of contracts are morality clauses. They're pretty common. And what I mean by that is that it kind of allows the parties, usually the brand, to get out of the contract with a student athlete or influencer if that person engages in conduct that's kind of specified in it, but basically something that makes the brand not want to associate with this person any longer, getting arrested, sometimes like going to rehab, that sort of thing. It'll kind of be in there. I'm not giving that a moral judgment, but we kind of call these morality clauses. Some of them are really, really broad, where it's not just the actual individual themselves, but like anyone associated with that individual, which, it's like anybody you've shared space with, basically, I feel like sometimes does something naughty, and maybe gets in the news because they're affiliated with you, and then the brand doesn't want to work with you any longer. You have to think about that. Is it reciprocal? Are there situations where maybe you wouldn't want to be associated with a brand? So let's say you agree to, I'm not going to name a brand because I'll get in trouble, but agree to work with a restaurant, and all of a sudden the restaurants, as some restaurants throughout the years have gotten in trouble for some of their hygiene practices and getting people sick. Maybe you won't want to be affiliated with them while all that's going on. Is there something that then you could do to get out of the contract at the end? Generally, we like to see things that go both ways, not just against the student who I'm advising or my client. I want to see things that kind of are reciprocal. Modification, can the contract be modified? If so, how? Most contracts can be modified in writing and signed by both parties. You definitely want to put it in writing. No handshake deals. If there's a written contract that says one thing and you guys are changing it, please put it in writing. That way you have a record of that's how you're going to change it, preferably in something that's formal on paper that both parties sign. And then sometimes you'll see just kind of something that will save the contract if part of the contract is determined to be illegal in some way. So let's say the contract lasts for a specific term, but you're no longer a student athlete, and so the law will modify that term, but the rest of the stuff will be good if there's a provision that will save it. Duties, oops, did I go back? Disputes, excuse me, I must have misread that. Too busy looking at the other slide earlier. What happens if you don't agree on something? So they say you didn't do something that you were supposed to do, and you did, or there is this sort of thing, and stuff happens, you end up in a conflict. Is there a process for dealing with that? Can you terminate the contract that you talked about earlier? Or can you go to court? Are you required to go to arbitration? That's something we see a lot in contracts. Arbitration is where you agree to settle disputes privately with an arbitrator instead of going to court. And so there might be then some stuff in the arbitration clause about who picks the arbitrator, who pays for the arbitrator, because there are costs to hire arbitrators, and stuff like that. What sort of guidelines are they going to be following? There's some national groups that set rules for how arbitration goes. And that's really quite common in a lot of contracts to see arbitration clauses. As an attorney for the little guy, we don't always love to see those because, there's some criticisms of arbitration, but there also are some criticisms for sure of our court system. If you can go to court, where, like a venue provision, like if I'm doing a deal with a brand based out of Miami, even though I'm up here, do I need to go down to Miami to sue them because the contract says that they can be sued in Miami-Dade County? What choice of law? If I'm doing a deal with a brand based in Delaware, is a lot of brands are incorporated in Delaware. Do I have to, be subject to Delaware law in the contract dispute? Those are pretty common provisions, I will say, in the NIL and social media contracts that I've seen. It's a mix. Some of the smaller ones are Florida, but it can be a mix of where it would be. If you involve an attorney, who pays for that attorney? Attorneys are really expensive. $250 is kind of like the base going price. I'm starting to see more like $300 an hour. So who's going to pay for that attorney, in dispute? For example, in the law, in most leases, it says that if I have a dispute with my landlord, I'm responsible for their attorney's fees. So, if they sue me because I didn't pay my rent and I get evicted, they can also ask for their attorney's fees. However, if they sued me because they said I didn't pay my rent, but I actually paid it and I won and I hired an attorney, I'd be able to get my attorney's fees paid. So, it's kind of one thing that you're looking at that can be really expensive quite quickly at those numbers. So it's something definitely to keep in mind. Unless the law says so, or you have a contract provision that says so, each party pays for their own attorney. So it's definitely something to add into a calculation if there is a dispute as far as what your risk would be moving forward. Okay, endorsements. So I used a couple of examples here so that you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about. So the GOAT, Simone Biles, she endorses Athleta, female sportswear brand, is one of her brands that she does business with. And then this is Khaby Lame. This is while he was doing a fashion show of sorts with Hugo Boss. So have those two as their examples. So if you're endorsing, if you're promoting a brand, basically content, you have to look at who's developing that content. Is the student athlete or influencer developing the content? Is the brand developing the content for the person to use? Again, do you have the power to veto it? How long do you have to keep it on your platforms? These are all things you have to think about. Are you going to be provided any other products as part of this deal? A lot of times you'll see the brand agree to give so many pairs of shorts or whatever it is, t-shirts to the person. So that's like value in kind products that you're getting. Or access to certain things. If it's a place, if it's a restaurant, can you host a private party there? Are they giving you something tangible in addition to other sorts of compensation? Does it make sense for your personal brand and financial future to be doing this sort of deal? You have to kind of think about that. And exclusivity. Again, I'm going to bring that up again because we do see it a lot. Does it make sense for you? Is it really, really broad? I had one basically that I reviewed that it was basically any retail store. I mean, it was so broad. So it's like, okay, you can do this retail store, which was kind of a specific subset of retail stores, but then you couldn't go out and have a different type of store. It's like shoe store and a jewelry store. It was so broad for the one that you wouldn't be able to do the other, even though in this theoretical situation, they don't sell the same things. So you have to keep that in mind as well when you're looking at stuff to make sure you're not limiting your opportunities if you're taking an endorsement deal. Licensing, again, I have a couple of examples here. Probably the most famous, most successful ongoing licensing deal that I could possibly think of is Air Jordans. Nike and Michael Jordan collaborating on a shoe that they still sell, some of which are very popular and make people a lot of money. And so I use that. That's kind of the quintessential licensing deal. And then I know for social media influencers, I'm not seeing as much, collabs and sort of that thing as much as I used to. Maybe it's just because of the subset of influencers that I get exposed to, but there's the Melio sisters. They collaborated with like a mobile electronics brand to do stuff like ring lights and other things so that you can look good on your TikToks and other content you may create. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So, if I make a deal with a brand to slap my name on it, or to have my photo or my name, other sorts of things associated with me, that can be a licensing deal. A lot of this stuff is going to go together. So if I am, agreeing, I don't know if Michael Jordan does a ton of advertising anymore for the Jordan shoes, but at one time, when he made the deal with Nike, you had to do so much advertising, commercials or whatever, in addition to having the Jordan on the shoe. But so there can be some definite overlap. Who creates the design? Do you have any veto power? How much input do you have into what that design is going to look like, or what the licensing deal is going to look like, the marketing for that deal is going to look like? Who owns the IP for the design? So the intellectual property, the stuff that's created. So the little Jordan, dunking on the shoe. Who owns that? Does Nike own that? Does Jordan have any sort of ownership rights into that? And I will say one thing for a student athlete, you do need to keep in mind that if you're kind of doing a deal like this, I know athletics talks about this and compliance talks about this, but there might be other licenses that they want to bring in. So if they wanted to do a t-shirt with you, or something else with you, and then also UCF athletics logos, then that's also a UCF license through athletics. And sometimes I have seen the brand try to put that back on the student to try to get the licenses. So make sure that you're all good on that, and that who's responsible for what, as far as that goes. Personally, I would recommend you have the brand do that, and be careful with any sort of licensed material that you might be wearing. If you're going to be doing stuff for someone, you probably want to wear some pretty generic stuff, so you're not infringing on anybody else's IP. And then who own. I think what's important is for the IP that you create, when the deal ends, who owns that? Can they use that again, or something similar? I think that's important if you want to protect your brand, that that's kind of clear what happens with that once this licensing deal is no longer going on. Are there royalties? So if you're on something, if it's something that you've helped develop, do you get paid a portion of the sales? Or do you have affiliate codes, which I know sometimes influencers do? Do you get paid a portion of the sales? How are they paid? How are they calculated? And any chance that they could go negative. So I had a deal that I reviewed with a small brand, and there were some royalties involved, and they had a very aggressive timeline for paying the royalties, which was great because the student got paid sooner than they would maybe in some other situations. But the problem with that is that returns counted against the royalties that the individual was to get. So because they were paid out so soon and there could be returns at the end, could there potentially be a negative balance? That's the kind of thing you have to look at, like, how are they calculated? How are they paid out? I don't know how likely it is for a scenario like that to happen. But it's just something to keep in mind if this is something that they're doing. Selling content. We used to see this a lot with influencers, or a lot more. I won't say I saw a ton of students this happened to, but I have seen some. And just in general, we used to see this more, is that like a person out on social media world would have like a one-off viral video, of some funny thing their cat did. And then you would see these third-party aggregators come and want to basically buy an exclusive license to that content. And so there has to be in a permanent exclusive license. So you would sell that to them. They would then get all the AdSense money or whatever it is from views of that content afterwards. So you have to think about, well, am I still creating content? So do I want somebody else to have my content and be doing things with it while I'm also trying to build my own brand? Something to think about. And then you don't really have control over how they might use that content. We still see that like a little bit, like I'll see reels or TikToks posted by like not the actual people, you know, it's kind of like someone who just tries to get views, to get revenue. But I'd say it's not as common as what I used to see maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, at least in my corner of the internet. Like I said a little bit earlier, there is some overlap between endorsement and licensing. So generally, if they're paying you to endorse a product, like they really want me to talk about like how great the shoe is, it's wonderful, and everyone should have one, then they might also then be licensing my image because I'd be doing something, you know, a photo shoot or other sorts of social media content, you know, as part of that. And then, you know, if they're using content that you create in their own marketing, how long can they do it? How long can they keep it up on their social media? You know, I don't want to say that I did a little sponsored post with shoe company 3 years ago and they're still trotting that out all the time. You know, that's something to think about. Basically, they might have not paid you a whole lot and now that was something that they're still using for their profit many, many months down the line. So you have to think about that. You know, especially if it's content you create, which I know people put a lot of time and work into making photos and videos and all sorts of things. You know, you want to make sure that's part of looking at it, to make sure that you're being fairly compensated for what you're doing. And, you know, if you're collabing on a product, usually there's some sort of marketing that you're required to do. So how much, what is it, you know, how often are you supposed to be talking about it? How much you have to do, that sort of stuff like that. So kind of put that out there like that. Brand creation. This is not really something we help with. We don't help with students starting businesses, unfortunately, here at Student Legal Services. But I did want to mention a little bit because I do see a lot of student athletes and others interested in creating their own brands. You know, keep that in mind. There's lots and lots of things to consider, lots and lots of taxes and intellectual property and becoming a corporation or LLC or whatever entity you decide to form. There's lots of things to consider. We really do urge people to consider that you think about hiring an attorney just to make sure you have everything right. Some attorneys will do a flat fee to help students or people start a small business. And there's lots and lots of resources out there. You know, so the Launchpad is here in the First Florida Student Union. The Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership is in the College of Business. Lots and lots of stuff on campus to help you kind of get started. Someone asked about the presentation, if you could have a copy of it. Just our email is down below. It's Stu Legal. Reach out to me via email and we'll go from there. stulegal@ucf.edu. Let's see. I just have here Allison Felix, the great Allison Felix, one of the most successful female track athletes, who's in her last season. She started her own shoe company, Seish, and Brad Mondo, hairstylist who does a lot of reaction videos, has his whole own hair care line. I think he started with the color. Now all sorts of stuff. I don't pay attention to all of it. And so those are things that like a lot of people then, you know, use their brand, their pursuits to then, you know, kind of make a company and hopefully do very, very well, even after maybe their athletic career ends or other things happen. Money matters. I mean, ultimately, that's the heart of all of these contracts, is that we are talking about money. And so A lot of these agreements are not going to be employee relationships. It means that this company is hiring me to do something, but I'm not actually their employee. So it's basically I'm an independent contractor. And then that means that you have to pay your own taxes. So my employer is UCF, and UCF pays a portion of my taxes and then does the other withholding so that I don't have to worry about it. But when you are an independent contractor, that is something you worry about. You do have to pay taxes on these funds. The IRS has a pretty decent section of their website where they talk about self-employed persons. So that's something definitely to check out. But I really would urge people, at least when they're getting started and they're doing some of this stuff, to consider consulting a tax professional, especially if you're going to want to take business deductions for certain expenses that you might have. It gets really complicated really quickly, and there's a lot of bad advice out there, and a lot of people get trapped up in it. So, make sure you consult the professional. I am not a tax professional. I can barely do my very own simple taxes. So, it's definitely something you want to do. You do also have to consider that while you are a student, if you are making money, that could go into as a factor of your future financial aid awards. So keep that in mind. I also am not an expert of financial aid. I know too much about student loans, way more than I ever wanted to. But there is that. I think if I understand correctly from what somebody told me, that it's like 2 years, 2 award years away, but definitely need to look into that. And you can always reach out to financial aid for that. And UCF does offer a lot of different financial education. I know there's like a personal finance course, at least there was at one time, that was very, very popular that people raved about. There's also Sensible Nights, which is associated with financial aid. They do a lot of financial education with all sorts of different people, including our office. We sometimes collaborate with them on different things to help to educate you about finances. There's just a lot of stuff out there. So please, consider taking advantage of that, especially if you are really able to capitalize on these things. You're going to want to make sure that, you kind of keep it going. So one of my things that I always see with a lot of these contracts that I have to ask myself, and if you've happened to see me when I've been out talking to student athletes or some other folks lately, is that I always say that the contract's not complete. I would say the vast majority of these contracts that I review are not complete. They are partial contracts. They have blanks. They refer to stuff that's not included in them. So you need to really kind of look at that. So, if you have to see, I had one that referred to you are supposed to comply with brand's social media guidelines attached as exhibit, whatever, and it wasn't there. So you're basically agreeing to something in the contract that you haven't even seen. Don't do that. So you have to look at that. Again, social media, that's a lot of what we see. It says you have to do social media, but it's not specific. It really can be very vague, or they want you to be on a podcast, and they don't talk about when, where, how, why, how long. You have to think about all those things. As far as how this makes sense to you and your brand. So you got to think about all of that. So one of the things that I do when I'm trying to review a contract, and it's a skill, it takes some time, is that when I am looking at a deal, I'm looking at any sort of contract, and NIL, independent contractor, employment contract with Amazon, Facebook, Google, whoever you guys are going out to work with after you leave UCF, or even a lease. I have to think about the practicalities of what is being asked to be done, and is it all included? So I picked a fairly simple example here, but I think it kind of shows you the thought process. and maybe it will be helpful for you, and I hope it is. So say you're just required to do a paid appearance at an event. Maybe you're, what are you supposed to be doing? You know, who pays for your transportation? Are you responsible for your own transportation? When do you have to arrive? Is it before how long before the event starts? Is there any sort of pre-marketing that you have to do? Do you have to announce it on your social media? You know, all sorts of stuff like that that you need to take into account. What sort of requirements do you have? Do you have to, you know, talk to people, meet and greet, that sort of things? Can the brand use photos or video taken of that event to then use for their future marketing? You might only be paid a couple $100 for your time there, and that might seem like a good deal. But then if the brand is then using your image to promote themselves and presumably profiting from that, is that a good deal? So, you know, you have to think about all of those things. And some of these are things that when we talk together, we're able to brainstorm on. Certainly, I've learned a lot from students over the years. So these are definitely kind of my thought process of how I look at these things really. And then that kind of helps me figure out what the holes are. Or some of the things that we talked about earlier, how they could play out for you. So that's definitely things to keep in mind. So some closing kind of thoughts for this. Get it in writing, no handshake agreements. It's a bad idea. You know, always kind of get in writing. You can see even something as simple as, you know, going to sign autographs at the car dealership for 2 hours can be more complicated than you might originally think it is. You know, and so you have to think about that. It's better to lay out all the terms at the beginning rather than to try to fill them in later. You know, I think judges really don't like using what we call parole evidence, you know, stuff outside the contract to try to figure out what the party's intentions were. It's much better just to not have any sort of ambiguity or things left up to chance. I would much rather spend my time, if I'm getting into some sort of arrangement, kind of clarifying all the details up front, rather than wait until later to try to figure things out or be like, oh, we'll just figure things out. No, that's when trouble happens. That's when disputes happen. So it's better to try to like just come together, iron things out, and go from there. Do not sign a contract with blanks. I have seen several contracts. I don't know if it's just because what they're providing for my client to have someone review is not yet the finalized contract, and that's fine. I'll review it, but you know, I can only give you so much if there's pretty substantial blanks in it. So, you know, make sure everything's filled in and make sure it's stuff that you agree with. Confidentiality is usually something that's going to survive a contract. It might be forever. So if you agree that something is going to be confidentiality, you know, or excuse me, confidential, it's late in the afternoon for me. Then you need to make sure that you, you know, keep quiet and just don't get yourself in that. Again, international students, please consult with UCF Global or an immigration attorney before you enter into any sort of deals. The last I heard was something that immigration officials were taking it into consideration, but I don't think if anything has come of that. It's not caught my attention. Again, we don't practice immigration, so we're not able to advise you on that. And this is not an exclusive list of everything that you should be considering. Things change. People are coming up with new things all the time. Social media is coming up with new things all the time. I don't TikTok. I don't Discord. What is Discord? I don't know. So, you know, it's something that's constantly evolving. So there might always be different things. This is just kind of a taste of the main things that you should be kind of thinking of when you're looking at any sort of contract, especially these types of contracts. I don't see any more questions. I'll give you guys like a minute here to kind of get in with any sort of last minute questions. Our office is in the Student Union in 304. We offer in-person, phone, and virtual consultations. Currently, I do all of the name, image, likeness reviews for student athletes. So it would be me. Hi. And I try to be very, very flexible. And in general, our office for anything, we do try to be flexible within reason. So if you need us and, you know, it needs to be done in a short period of time, or, you know, maybe because of your commitments, maybe you need an appointment that's a little bit later in the day than what we typically would offer, or a little bit earlier, or during lunch when we don't necessarily always have appointments. We just have to ask, and we will see what we can make work for you. Not promising that we'll always be able to accommodate everything because of court and all sorts of other stuff, but we do try. Consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. We don't spam, we don't post a lot of stuff, but we are developing a number of short videos on specific topics. Like we have one on scams and purchasing a used car currently, and we're planning on more in the future. And so, and that also helps us with having access to some other features of YouTube. So we appreciate it if you do. If you have any questions or issues, or you want to schedule an appointment with us, our contact information is below. If you're not sure and you just want to ask us a question, our email is below, the Stu Legal email. stulegal@ucf.edu. And your student, you know, be happy to try to, you know, answer that or point you in the right direction the best we can. And then if you know someone who this video would be helpful for, part of the reason why we do it here on YouTube is because it will be available afterwards, so that if someone couldn't make it here today live, they can at least watch the replay. And not seeing any other questions. Thank you very much. Again, we're located in Student Union 304. Our contact information is below, and we hope that everyone has a wonderful afternoon. It's kind of rainy, so stay dry, guys.